Welcome to READ, the Research Education Advocacy Podcast. READ connects you with researchers, educators, and thought leaders on topics in education and child development. READ is produced by the Windward Institute. I'm your host, Danielle Gomez, and I am joined by a researcher that is among the top respected researchers at Windward. At the Windward School, we employ a lot of evidence-based practices in our reading and our writing programs, and we've learned so much from and implemented so many highly effective instructional practices in writing based on this researcher's studies for decades. And so if you're listening, obviously you see this person on YouTube if you're watching, but if you're listening, I bet you can already guess. I'm so delighted to be joined by Dr. Steve Graham. Dr. Graham, welcome to the READ podcast.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. And I just want to know, how are you? How are you showing up to this conversation, and where are you in the world right now?
Well, right this minute, I'm in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I've been doing great. I'm probably in my 45th year of doing work related around writing, and I probably won't have 45 more years of that, but I do hope to have another 5 to 10 years where I'm still doing research.
That's amazing. I was actually talking to my husband last night at dinner about your work, and he's in law, but I was telling him about you, and he was like, oh my gosh, wow, what a legacy. And to say that the legacy that you are leaving in the writing, the reading, the education world is truly unmatched. And so for those of you, I believe every READ podcast listener will know who you are, but for those of you that want to dive into Dr. Graham's formal bio, we'll have that linked on the READ podcast website. And for those of you that are tuning in on YouTube, you can just click and you'll be directed to that link. But to give some of our READ listeners some context, like I said, that your research has informed so much of our instruction at Windward. Our expository writing program, for example, is grounded in a lot of the research, all the research that you've been doing. I know that you're the Regents and the Warner Professor in the Division of Leadership and Innovation at Arizona State University. And like you said, 45 years of research on how writing develops, how to teach it effectively, and how writing can be used to support reading and learning. We'll talk a lot about a number of your meta-analysis that you've done, including reports like Writing Next and Right to Read and the IES guides. And I can go on and on. I'm really excited to talk to you. So I just want to start from your perspective is to tell us your story of your life, your professional journey to how you led to over 45 years of research on writing.
So in some ways, my story actually starts in about first grade. I was an extremely active child, and probably if ADHD would have existed as a label at the time, I would have been labeled as ADHD. My report cards for the first 4 grades always had, no matter where we were at, and we moved quite oftenly, they would say 3 things: can't sit still, can't keep his hands off of others, and refuses to be quiet. Not particularly a dream of most primary grade teachers' classrooms. When I started thinking about what I wanted to do in terms of a career, I was pretty certain I wanted to teach. And I had been a history major in college, but it was very difficult in a rural area to find a job teaching history. And I thought about it a little bit more, and I thought, maybe I'd like to work with kids who find school challenging, because I really found in the elementary grades school to be very challenging. It loosened up for me as I hit 5th grade, but before that point, I did not like school. And I walked into Valdosta State College of Education, where I had been going to school in Valdosta, Georgia, down on the Georgia-Florida line. And they had a new professor from the University of Kansas there who was working in the area of learning disabilities. And he gave me an assistantship that day. And I was kind of stunned about it. And then eventually he helped me get into college at the same place that he went, the University of Kansas. And the person that was so influential in my life was a guy named Lemoyne Miller. And my first job, I got to work with him. But initially, I wanted to be a reading researcher. And primarily because I didn't feel that I had a good grounding in how to teach reading through my undergraduate and master's program. And so when I went to the University of Kansas, I minored in reading. And I did what I think you might call a mediocre dissertation. Nobody ever likes to admit that, but I think that's probably the case. And my minor person who was in the area of reading at the end said something you really never want to hear. She said it in private, But she said, you could have done better than the study you did. And I thought about it, initially it stung a little bit, but as I thought about it, I thought, she's right. This isn't really my main interest. My main interest started to be writing. I didn't consider myself a good writer, but I was having to write a lot for classes and starting for publication, and I was fascinated by it. And I've been reading the Paris reviews, which are interviews with famous writers like Norman Mailer, and they talked a lot about process. And I thought, this is really what I'm excited about, but I hardly knew anything about it. And so for the first 3 years that I was out, I was at Auburn University for 2 years and then Purdue for 2 years. And those first 3 years there, I did a review every year that was kind of historical, going back as far as I could, one on composition and teaching writing more generally, one on handwriting and one on spelling. And my interest was primarily at that point, kids with special needs, because I'd been a special education teacher. So I kind of came at this through maybe not a way that you're typically expecting. I wasn't a good writer, and I had been told by one of my committee members that my work could have been better, but it actually, sometimes when things go a little awry, it can be a good thing in life, and it was for me.
Yeah. I love that story. Thank you for that journey. And like you said, yeah, like it's perhaps a lot of times when I hear in research, and I know for me, it's that thing that you want to seek to improve in yourself, perhaps. And I love how you made that transition to writing, and intersection too with students with learning disabilities, I think has made such an impact in the field. Was there any aspects of your writing research that, you see like different eras or chapters? Like, did you focus on one aspect of writing, maybe in the first part of your career, and then did you investigate different parts of the writing process or writing in general over your career?
Well, so I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Karen Harris, who's my wife. So she was a doctoral student at Auburn when I was a visiting assistant professor, and she had done in her master's degree at University of Nebraska a study with kids who, it's a little strange because we don't usually think about it this way, kids who were extremely shy. So there may be some point at which you've met somebody who has difficulty in social situations, talking with others, and it seems to cut across all social situations. It's not situational. It tends to be, most situations they're involved in. And she'd done an interesting study using cognitive behavior modification, which was just in the late 70s, starting to be used in psychiatry and psychology. And as we started talking about what we were interested in, we talked about the application of that to writing. And so she designed an instructional approach, which is probably the most tested writing approach of any time, self-regulated strategy development. And so when we first started, she designed this intervention. I would design some of the writing strategies. And we were really focused in on kids with learning disabilities. Now, over time, that spread out to include kids who were identified as having ADHD, kids with behavioral difficulties, and I've been doing some work with kids with speech and language difficulties, as well as kids who have been identified with deaf and hard of hearing. And so for a long time, that was our focus. Interventions, looking for things that work, testing them out. And it involved both strategy instruction around planning, revising, evaluating, etc. But also we started taking a look at handwriting and spelling, because a lot of the kids that we saw with special needs had difficulty with those skills, as well as sentence construction.
Right.
And when inclusion started to become more popular, we realized that we're going to need to shift our focus. We need to be thinking about the whole class and what's going on in writing. And so in that point, we shifted. We did a number of national surveys to try to get a handle on what was going on. And our research then tended to shift, where much of it started being with whole classes instead of small groups of students. And also, I started to shift to using meta-analysis as a way of aggregating the literature. And I think at this point, I've probably done somewhere around 2022 meta-analysis to get a handle on, what really works in terms of scientific evidence, in terms of writing. Now, there's been other little side steps along the way, but I think, the instructional research that we've done, the meta-analysis, the national surveys, In addition, we've done stuff trying to get a handle on how writing operates, but those would be the main focuses. And throughout that, Karen and I have worked together.
Yeah. I was actually just reading one of your books that you co-authored. I think it was Writing Effectively, is it 2005? But even I know you have a number of books that you co-authored with her. And so I was actually, we're prepping for a class on the writing process and moving from organizers to outlines. And I was pulling some of your research on self-regulated strategy development. But I want to start with the reading writing connection. And I know you've commented a lot about this on more recent podcasts. It seems that we're hearing about the reading writing connection a lot recently in anywhere from research to popular discourse, but this is something that you've been talking about for decades. And in a 2020 paper you wrote, you said reading and writing are connected at the most intimate level. So can you share with us more? Why are reading and writing so closely interlinked, and illustrate really what happens when instruction ties that reading and writing so well?
Okay. So I think there's three ways, and I'm going to channel Timothy Shanahan at University of Chicago at Illinois in this, because it's, you want to shout out to people who kind of provided the theoretical underpinnings for what you do. He talks about three different theoretical approaches for doing this, or thinking about reading and writing connections. And one's a pretty obvious one. And that is that reading and writing draw on the same pools of knowledge and processes. So if you think about something like decoding words and spelling words, obviously they're drawing upon your knowledge of, orthography and phonology and how they connect together, as well as meaning, but they're overlapping, and potentially improvement in one area. If you work on spelling, you would expect that you become a better decoder. That's one way of looking at it. And there's multiple levels that you could look at that. You could also think about it in terms of the kind of cognitive processes one uses. People set goals when they read. We also have goals when we write. And so they overlap with each other. They're not identical, but they're overlapping, and you basically have resources you can draw on for both. Another way of thinking about this is from a social cognitive point of view, or social cultural point of view, is that they both are involved with meaning making or understanding. And so that when you write, there's the potential, if you're thinking about your audience, that you're having a cross communication in your head with the reader. And that can also be helpful in terms of when you read, about thinking about, hey, what was the author trying to do here? Why was he trying? Why did they use this particular set of words? What are they trying to get me to think about? And so you can see where these kind of cross things, this kind of crosstalk can be helpful in terms of reading and writing, and can inform each other. And then a third is what I consider a functional view. And that is, we use reading sometimes to help us write. For example, we read source material to gain something to write about. But at the same time, when we write about what we're reading, that can help comprehension and remembrance. But we can also combine the two to help us in terms of learning. So reading and writing are learning tools. And so, now when I talk about reading, writing connections, I really like to make it reading, writing, and learning. So those would be the theoretical underpinnings. Now, in terms of what this means instructionally, and what we found in the meta-analysis that we've conducted, is that if you increase the amount of time that students spend writing, there is a corresponding positive effect on their reading comprehension, and vice versa. You increase how much they read, there's a small but significant effect on the quality of their writing. So that kind of fits with that social cultural viewpoint. We also find that if you teach certain things, like if you teach spelling, decoding gets better, but we also find that reading comprehension gets better, which, probably because you can decode faster. That helps you in terms of comprehending text, because it's not interfering anymore. You teach sentence construction skills through sentence combining. Reading fluency gets better. You teach students about the purposes and the elements of text when writing. That can have a positive effect. That genre structure, genre elements, genre grammar, if you'd like, can have a positive effect on reading, because when you read, now if you know what the basic elements are of a persuasion, it gives you something to tie information to. So you can see also how, from that kind of well that we draw on the same knowledge or processes,
Mhm.
that the teaching process, not just writing, but actually teaching one of these makes a difference. And then, I'll wrap it up by saying we did a meta-analysis taking a look at what happens when you balance reading and writing instruction. And by balance here, I just mean 40% of the time is on reading and 60% on writing, or vice versa, 60% on reading, 40% on writing, but you have about an equal amount of time.
Yeah.
And the good news is that when you do that, reading gets better, writing gets better.
Mhm.
So bringing connections between these two, taking advantage of them is something that we want to do. It's beneficial for writing, but
Yeah.
it's also beneficial for reading. And I would say that, when you think of the big five in reading, teaching phonology, teaching phonics, teaching vocabulary, teaching reading fluency, or facilitating reading fluency, and teaching comprehension strategies, we should be adding to that teaching writing.
Yep. I agree. I love what you talked about all those, and you brought that window, I think, over all the comprehensive nature of writing and how each element could continue to build that picture of the reading writing connection. I'm already like, you need to come see a Windward classroom because it's also a window into our instructional pedagogy, right? When you're talking about using sentence combining strategies to even support comprehension, I think there's an interesting piece where you're elevating and shining that light on reading, and you're elevating and shining that light on writing, but they're both equally at it, like becoming that vehicle to, continue to push each other forward, right? Like you can have writing strategies that continue to, contribute to comprehension. And then you have reading elements of a good reading program, like looking at text structure and areas of reading that also contribute to writing. When you talked about decoding and spelling, right? That interplay. I think that's really critical for our readers, any educator to know. One question I have, and maybe this is something you already touched upon, but it's one that I always have on top of mind, is that when you talk about adding more time for writing, perhaps from a person on the outside or just someone, an educator, a teacher, a school leader saying, okay, we're going to add more time for writing. Where does that time go? Right. And I think sometimes in education, we get into this cycle of, okay, we're going to implement something new, so something else must be taken away or de-implemented. And so when you talk about adding more time for writing, you're not talking about taking anything else away. Can you comment more on what that means for instructional time?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One, we need to become more efficient with time. So when I
Mm-hmm.
talked about that balance before between reading and writing, that 60-40 or 40-60, the real issue here in most of those studies, they were separate instruction. They were not directly tied to each other. But we could, instead of having separate spelling and separate decoding instruction, that each might take, say, 15 minutes each, we
Mm-hmm.
could look for ways of tying those together. So then what we're talking about is maybe 20 or 22 minutes of time. So I think if, on the one hand, if we can find ways that we can bring reading and writing instruction together in reasonable and meaningful ways, it can reduce the amount of time that we spend, when we think about collective time for each one of those. So
Mm-hmm.
it's using our time more efficiently. The
Right.
second thing is that in the handbook, excuse me, in the What Works Clearinghouse Guide at the elementary level, we made a recommendation. It was an expert recommendation. It wasn't based on evidence but we all agreed on the panel that at least an hour a day should be devoted to writing. Now, when I say that, and you're talking about elementary level, in surveys, we find that teachers devote about 40 minutes a day to writing in
Mm-hmm.
first to third grade and about 30 minutes a day um, from fourth grade to sixth grade. So that's obviously a lot more time.
Right.
But one of the things that we can do is we can have writing occur in other subject areas. And there's evidence that when you do that, when you write about what you're learning, or you
Mm-hmm.
write about what you're reading in those subject areas, it increases your understanding and comprehension, whether it's social studies, whether it's science, or whether it's math. And so I think we also want to look for ways of integrating writing directly into and be better at doing that
Mm-hmm.
across the curriculum. I think you're completely right. I can go around saying we need to do this an hour a day, but the pushback's going to be is we don't have the time. And
Right.
unless you see it as important and contributing to other aspects of learning, it's probably
Mm-hmm.
not going to happen.
Yeah. In synthesizing the research, oftentimes when I communicate to educators, it's curriculum coherence and curriculum consistency that you're tying in, let's say even reading and writing, not only in a traditional ELA block, but in science and social studies, even leveraging some of those tools in math, right? And then consistently ensuring that you're giving that time for students to practice the strategies, right? When we talk a little bit more about self-regulated strategy development, the kids aren't going to learn it with one exposure, right? That it takes this modeling and practice, group collaboration, teacher collaboration, and then for them to apply it independently, right? And especially for students with learning disabilities, they benefit from those extra exposures. So I love how you framed that. I'm wondering if you can comment about the role of oral language. I know you said you were talking about writing and helping with folks in the speech and language. Is there an interplay between oral language and writing? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. And so I'm going to mention two meta-analyses, one we've conducted and one that's not out yet, but Young Suk Kim at University of California at Irvine and her students have conducted. We took a look at, for kids with speech and language difficulties, in studies that compared their writing with kids who didn't have such difficulties, were there differences? And not surprisingly, kids who have challenges with speech and language also have challenges with writing, just as do kids with reading challenges. In terms of Young Suk Kim's meta-analysis, they looked at the relationships between writing and oral language in kids in general. And what they found is that, not surprising, writing is related to how well you speak and how well you understand language. But the relationships are not constant across the types of measures that you look at. So they're much more constant across kind of finite measures that might take a look at, single aspects of writing like spelling, etc., or vocabulary and vocabulary aspects of language. But when you start getting up to meaning, they're still significant, but they're a little less connected. There's another way of thinking about this, and that is that oral language provides the foundation on which we write and read, right? You're not going to be writing and reading without this oral language foundation. Here comes the challenge, though, and it works in one way and it doesn't work so well in another, is, by the time that most kids are 5 or 6 years of age, it's not that they're not going to learn more language, because clearly they're going to learn a lot more vocabulary as they move through school and into adulthood, but they've already mastered a good bit of the language that they're going to acquire. So language develops very rapidly at a young age. Now, we're not even, we're kind of getting started on the road at the earliest, around 3, in terms of writing, and it's a lifelong struggle. I'm going to put it that way for many people in terms of thinking about writing. It's a very challenging skill. And so the question then becomes, for something that develops early, is this a reciprocal relationship? If I teach writing, does your oral language get better? And there's some evidence that, some small parts actually improve. The other direction is, okay, if I teach oral language, do you become a better writer? And so what the evidence suggests there is, we don't really know when it comes to like large oral language programs. If you're just teaching oral language, does that mean you become a better writer? We don't know. I'm suspicious that that's the case. So I think it's probably not going to pan out to be true. However, if you teach something like sentence skills through sentence combining in an oral manner, there is transfer effects to writing. If you teach phonological awareness without letters, now that's not what I would suggest doing. In studies that have done that, there's usually an improvement in spelling. So when the skills are really well connected, there seems to be a jump, a transfer effect. However, if we're talking about oral language generally, it doesn't seem to make much difference in terms of writing with the little bit of information we have now. But I'd have to say I'd be very cautious about interpreting that, because we just haven't done enough in that area to make any kind of definitive conclusions, if such a thing is ever possible.
Right. Yeah. That is so interesting. I have so many thoughts. I think my first, from a research hat perspective, perhaps, is it because of, certain maybe research questions or the fidelity of the program implementation, right? When you talked about oral sentence combining is improving writing, that makes sense, because there's this mechanism, you're teaching that and the kids are actually applying that strategy. Whereas if, perhaps other programs that might not be as targeted, would that make sense as like one, possible?
So one way of thinking about this is to think about generalization. And so,
Mhm.
we like to think that we're really good at generalizing what we learn. And this is not the only way of thinking about generalization, but one way that's been put forward is a low road to generalization and a high road. And it shouldn't be taken that a low road is negative and a high road is positive. But a low road is, all of us have experienced this, is like if you get into a car, when they used to have a keyhole that you could put the key in and turn it, you didn't even have to think about it when you got in another car. You knew that there was a keyhole. They gave you a key. You knew where to put it. You've done this time and time again. So any car you got into, it worked for you. You had a kind of low road of generalization. It happened over and over again. And then all of a sudden you go to rent a car and you have the key and you get in and there's no place to put the key. And you're like stuck. What do I do? This happened to me in a car rental place and I had to get out and go ask somebody. And I had to put my foot on the brake and push, a button, which we don't think about today, right? Because that's the way that we start cars. But the first time that you encounter that, what you tend to do is you look at surface level features. Oh, I'm used to a car. There's where the key goes. And that's the low road. With the high road, I might try to think my way through it and try different combinations, although I wasn't successful at this. And as a result, I had to ask somebody else. So generalization is difficult. And the more the skills are complementary or, kind of mimic each other or similar to each other, the more likelihood you're going to generalize if you don't help students do that or help people do that. So one of the things that, when we talk about reading and writing and generalization and oral language here, we're talking about unassisted generalization. Of course, I might be able to do this and assist you in a way that enhances generalization. So instead of hoping and praying for it, we actually do something about it.
Right.
And so, I could do something like with reading where we're reading along and there's a cliffhanger at the end and I point it out and we talk about it and then I have kids try it in their own writing. So the hope and pray is I don't have them try it out in their own writing and give them feedback. But in terms of doing something about it, I set up an instructional activity so that they have a chance to try it out in a different situation than the one that they encountered it in.
Right. That must speak to the importance of explicit instruction, right? Or just the cycle of teaching, modeling, practice, feedback, right? Especially with writing.
Yes. Now, don't get me wrong. People learn incidentally as well as explicitly.
Yep. Yeah.
My own take on kids with learning disabilities is that in some ways they have an implicit learning disability, that learning implicitly for many kids with learning disabilities doesn't come as easily or naturally. And explicit learning really works really well with kids with learning disabilities in my experience. But that's not to say that they don't learn some things implicitly and they also learn things explicitly, and that applies to all kids in general.
Yeah.
I think it's more of a struggle with kids with learning disabilities on the implicit end.
Right. I love that you made that comment. That's such a great way to conceptualize it too. So speaking of instruction, your research, you've already talked about on this podcast, but your research extensively examines these key features of effective writing programs and also instructional practices and interventions, which we talked about. And we'll link a lot of that work that highlights this area of research on READ. And I think if we talked about all of them, we might be here for days and you might miss your next meeting. And so we'll just focus on a few. But you've written extensively about the importance of comprehensive writing programs that teach the process of writing. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by writing process?
Okay. So, and there's a little trepidation whenever I do this because sometimes when you say something, then it gets played out to a maximum, which really wasn't your intention. So I'm going to have some caveats along the way. When you look at kids when they first start to write, it's kind of like a conversational term. They generate a sentence or two, like what they're in a conversation, but they actually have no conversational partner that's directly there with them. And it doesn't go much further than that. The other thing that you see is, as I like to refer to it, as the Vulcan mind dump. Basically we ask them to write something and they think of something that's kind of topic appropriate and maybe genre appropriate. So I would like for you to write a story about, a cow in the field. and the kid writes, once upon a time there was Betsy the cow. So, you got the element of the genre feature there with once upon a time. And, it's caused me to think about, Betsy in the field. So I've done the thing. But what we see in this mind dump is they dump whatever's out, and then that serves as a stimulus for the next idea, which serves as stimulus for the next idea. And it's very different than what we see with people who are, skilled writers, because they often plan in advance. They think about organization, they think about their audience. As they're writing, they continue to plan. They think about connecting stuff. And kids at the start are just kind of doing this mind dump, one thing after another. And sometimes they just end, and you see this a lot with kids with learning disabilities. It's an impoverished text. There's not a lot of ideas or information about each of the ideas, and things that you expect to see in a story are missing from it, if you're a 6 or 7-year-old kid. So when we talk about a process to writing, we're talking about engaging kids in thinking. Planning is a way of thinking. That includes things like goal setting, getting information to write about, organizing it would be 3 kind of basic processes, which drives, what you draft. And during that drafting time, you're continuing with planning and you're monitoring and evaluating what you're doing. And so we expect that kids are going to monitor and evaluate and make revisions as they write. But we also like to have kids come back and polish what they do. And that would include revising and editing. So, the way that this has kind of gotten set up is we say, oh, kids should plan, write, revise, edit, and share. And there's nothing wrong with that. But in reality, if you're a good writer, these things are recursive. They're, interrupting each other as you're engaged in the process. When I'm planning, I might revise something. And so we want kids to become flexible in the use of those. Yeah. And then here's the kicker on this is we don't do that for everything we write.
Yeah.
Right. So kids need to learn when to engage in this kind of massive amount of effort and when that's not necessary. They're already doing it as kind of their fallback. But one of the ways of thinking about this, if I write a note to my wife saying, I've gone to the gym, we'll be back later, it's not going to be the next masterpiece in writing.
Right.
It's just going to be a draft. There's going to be little thinking going in on that. And so when I talk about process to writing, it's for students to engage in planning, drafting, revising, editing, and sharing, but there can be a mix of those things going on. And sometimes I'm not doing all of those things because I may have other goals, personal goals as a writer, or there may be other instructional goals as a teacher. And I know I gave a very complicated vision of that, but I'll add one other thing to it. And that is, it's not hard to get kids to engage in planning, say up front before they write. You can ask them to do that. Right. They'll generate some notes and stuff, but often they don't have very successful strategies for doing so. So we also need to help them acquire the skills to plan effectively for the genre they're writing, the skills to revise effectively, the skills to monitor and evaluate what they're doing effectively. And that's where there's this combination where strategy, instruction, and the process approach come together. In typical classrooms that use the process approach, there's not a lot of emphasis typically on explicitly teaching kids how to carry out those processes. And I think for kids with learning disabilities, that is absolutely essential that they learn how to do that.
I almost stood up and clapped for that. The way that you just captured that, I think, is so important. And I almost wish that when we go back to edit this, we repeat what you just said, because I think that's the key here, right? We see process and this explicit and incorporation of strategy instruction, right? So what I hear you talking about here is particularly as it pertains to process, what you're really saying is that it's important, but it's certainly dependent on the purpose of the writing and the audience. And yeah, not every kid is going to be engaging deliberately in that process all the time, or else maybe we wouldn't get anywhere, right? But it really does matter based on purpose and audience.
That is absolutely correct. And it also, I would say it depends on what students can bring to the task. And that's why strategy instruction is so important, because it gives them the skills to carry out those processes when they need to apply them for tasks that they're appropriate to apply to. But what I've seen too often in classrooms is we plan, we draft, we revise, we edit. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. but it doesn't really fit what skilled writers do. They're much more flexible in
Mhm.
terms of their use of these processes, and they make decisions about, which processes to use when and which processes interrupt each other as they're being applied. And we'd
Yeah.
like for kids to be that flexible as well.
Mhm. So that leads us into self-regulated strategy development, right? And when you talked about that, I think, you know, what I like about SRSD is it's this incorporation of a gradual model of release, right? That the goal is for students to become independent, to be self-regulated writers, right? To set goals on their own. And so can you share more about, I love getting into this part because it's very extensively well
It's one of
researched, right?
in writing, it is the most commonly researched instructional technique that exists. I think at this point, there's probably somewhere between 100 to 200 studies that have looked at its effectiveness, some in very controlled ways and some that have been a little sloppy, because the research varies. But, probably next to it, the most frequently assessed approach would be something like process learning or the
Mhm.
use of digital tools. So, but its effect sizes, and especially for kids with special needs, you know, are 1.0 or higher. And that's incredible because there's nothing that kind of comes close to that
Right.
in terms of writing research. And
Yeah.
it's been applied in probably 30 different countries at this point.
So can you walk us through the process of
Yeah.
self-regulated strategy development?
Yeah. I want to give a little bit of history about this and it'll make a little bit more sense. When Karen developed this, she really was interested in three aspects of development, and one is strategic. And so, one of the ways in which you move from being novice to competent in an area is by becoming more strategic in that
Mhm.
area. So you have ways of dealing with information as you get it. You become more facile in terms of the types of strategies used, and the strategies become more complex over time. Another thing is that our knowledge increases as we move from being a novice to competence, so that it's more interrelated and it's broader and we can draw upon that. And also motivation. The more we become better at something, we tend to feel more efficacious about our skills there. And usually we like it a bit better. Writing's a little funny on this, but she divide, excuse me, she devised this with those three ideas in mind. How can we do something with kids who find school and learning challenging that would address all three of these aspects? And so the focal point around this in self-regulated strategy development is on teaching students usually genre-specific strategies for helping them plan and draft, or plan, draft, and revise, or edit, any one of those processes or all of them together. In addition, um, she also built in, and this is a unique feature of SRSD, the idea that students would learn to use self-regulation procedures. Now, strategies help you regulate how you go about a task, right? But
Right.
then she wanted to build in things like goal setting, self-monitoring, self-evaluation, the kinds of things that we say to ourselves in terms of self-talk and self-reinforcement, that students could use those kinds of things to help them regulate the strategies they were learning, to regulate the writing process, and in some instances, to help them regulate behaviors that are getting in the way.
Right.
So if you have a kid who never wants to plan in advance and you're
Mhm.
trying to teach them a strategy to plan in advance, well, some of that self-regulation could focus in on, getting them to take the time, to think about what they were going to write.
Right.
In addition, she wanted to be sure that students had the knowledge that they needed to use the strategies effectively. So, as an example of this, if you're teaching a strategy for planning and drafting a story, the strategy focuses around the basic elements of a story, like who, when, where, what happens to set the protagonist off, what are the protagonist's goals, what are the actions that occur, what are emotions of different characters in this, and how does this all end? Well, those are the basic building blocks of Western stories. And so, if you're going to teach a strategy that helps you generate ideas around those building blocks, you got to know what those building blocks are. It's also helpful if you have a good sense of what a good story looks like and what constitutes a good story. And so there's also this stuff around knowledge building. In addition, we were particularly concerned about efficacy. And so one of the self-regulation procedures is students set goals for like using the strategy or including all those basic, say, story elements, and they monitor whether or not they're successful at that. And the strategy instruction is set up through a gradual release model that almost ensures that they're going to see, versus how they originally composed stories, they're going to be able to actually see their growth as writers, which should make you more efficacious. And that's done by having them evaluate their own writing and making visible their success. And it would start with, you're doing something with them together as a teacher. Well, of course they're going to be successful. You're leading the process, but then you're gradually releasing control with them doing it, and it keeps that level of success high so that they see that they're being successful with this. And what we say to them in terms of conferences is that the reason you're successful is because of effort. One, you're working really hard. We really appreciate that. And you're using strategies that will help you write better. Right. And so in some ways, that's the basic idea behind this. We usually introduce, helping them acquire the knowledge for the genre and what's good writing. That starts right at the first. We discuss the strategies that are going to be taught and why they're important and how you use them and the rationale behind it. And that's a discussion. And sometimes strategies get modified at that point. Sometimes kids come up with really good ideas, and then the teacher models, and they think aloud as they model, and they use self-statements, sometimes coping self-statements when things get hard. And once the teacher models, and students are helping her during the model or him during the modeling, but once they're done, we talk about, what did you say to yourself? As a teacher, what were the things I was saying to myself that might have helped me? And so we start down this process of students identifying things, at least one thing that they can say to themselves, especially in the elementary grade, that might be useful. And then that gradual release model kicks in full. We might still model again, depending on where our students are at, but then we move to students working together to support each other, and then eventually to them doing it independently. And I really like what you said, because I think sometimes this is missed when people look at strategy instruction. The goal is student independence. Mm-hmm. So if they had a graphic organizer to help them generate those story parts to begin with, mm-hmm. by the end, for us, they're creating their own graphic organizer that we don't have to give them a sheet, because we're not going to be out there with them all the time.
Right.
And then some of the very best stuff that I think we've done, we look for ways to help maintenance and generalization of what students are learning. And I'll give an example of this with second grade kids. We taught students that story writing strategy I was just mentioning, and a persuasive writing strategy where they generated ideas around, what their premise was going to be, the reasons and elaborations, etc. But they did all this other stuff. And so once they were close to mastery on this, we had kids work together to identify something they really liked in the instruction. And sometimes it was the self-assessment. Sometimes it was the goal setting. Sometimes it was the use of the strategy itself. And they identified places where they could use those outside of the classroom. And they talked with each other about how they would have to modify it for it to be successful. And then we couldn't go out and, with them as they did this. But when they came back a day or two later and we met with them, then we talk about, was it successful? Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. What would we modify, etc. And what we found was that engaging kids and thinking about how to use what they're learning in different contexts and different situations for the things that they were learning, we got some generalization to new genres and greater maintenance with kids. And, initially, if you'd have told me we were going to be able to do that with 7-year-olds, I would have said, you're crazy. But if you structure it well, kids have really good ideas about where to use what they're learning if we ask them. The problem is we don't always ask them.
Right. Yeah. And I have so many thoughts. And I like what you just said at the end. Reminded me, I spoke to Dr. Amy Elliman, who's a researcher in reading comprehension. And she talks similarly about using cognitive frameworks to facilitate structure for kids to really help them. She didn't say blossom, but how I kind of interpret it was like to fill in those pieces to really blossom in that sense. And so I like even what you said about even the role of self-assessment, like what a way to support student metacognition, right? For them to have those skills to self-question, right? And to monitor themselves throughout the process. So I have a lot of other questions about SRSD that I may keep you on a couple minutes after the recording. Just I have a couple of just other questions that maybe our listeners would like to hear, but I have you on the call. I might as well ask you. But so speaking of back to the writing process itself, back to strategy instruction, right? You're teaching these strategies to students, you're helping them monitor their own process. They get to the end, they have a product. What do we do now with assessment? Can you share more about your insights about how we assess then students in writing, what the research is telling us about assessment?
Okay. So, basically, I'm I'm not I like assessment for formative purposes.
Okay.
Okay.
Hmm.
I'm not as keen on assessment for summative purposes.
Hmm.
And sometimes summative purposes, we give a grade on something. And I know that, I was a teacher. I had to give grades myself. But what I'm really interested in is student growth, not student comparative growth.
Right.
And so, some students grow more and some students grow less at different times. And so what I like to do, and so this is not going to be evidence-based, I'm just giving you my own personal opinion on this, is I like to look at how students grow across time. And something like a portfolio is
Hmm.
really helpful for that. And especially if students are actively engaged in examining what they produce over time and thinking about what are their best pieces and why and how they've grown as a writer.
Right.
To me, that's better than giving a grade for student growth. Okay.
Hmm. Yeah.
So on the more formative end, though, I think there's three ways for us to think about this and possibly a fourth. And the evidence suggests that all four have some effect, and that is feedback. So where's the point at which we kind of provide our online assessments, and it's by giving students feedback about what they're doing. Now, we tend to focus in on what the product is, and that's okay, but feedback can be about process, it can be about product, it can be about this individual product, or it can be aimed at helping students think about something that they're saying to get them, to focus in a different way. Well, what do you think this character might think
Yeah.
happens at this point? So I'm not saying that, maybe you need to rewrite this sentence. I'm trying to get you to think a little bit more about your characters and their interaction in text. And so we know that when teachers give feedback, it has a positive effect on students' writing. We know that when you engage students in peer feedback in a structured way, not
Hmm.
just kind of saying, go give this guy feedback, but when you have a method to doing that that students can use that's reasonably straightforward and simple, that can be effective. The evidence on self-feedback also suggests that that's effective. And increasingly, we're going to see computer feedback as part of the mix here.
Right.
There's no way around that. And, we've just completed a couple of studies with AI with ChatGPT, and we found that the feedback that given by ChatGPT was almost as good as what you would think of as expert feedback givers. Not, typical teachers in the classroom, but people who had got quite a bit of extensive training on doing this. So we're going to see more and more of that. And I like that. And when you ask me about assessment, it's about assessment as you're learning for me, and not so much assessment about where you're at in the end compared to other people.
Yeah.
But I do realize that schools are not going to operate without that kind of comparison.
Right. What about the use of like rubrics?
So, a rubric, yeah, so I do use rubrics.
Hmm.
We use them in our research a lot of times.
Right.
And we use them in two different ways. One will sometimes use rubrics that have, kind of like the 6+1 trait
Right.
out of Northwest Regional Lab, but we'll also use rubrics that we develop that actually have samples of students writing as indicators. And in a sense, that's a comparative analysis, right?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I'm saying for instructional purposes, if I was still a teacher, I
Hmm.
would probably do the first thing. But obviously, as a researcher, I'm constantly in the comparison
Yeah.
world. And it's, without doing that, then nobody would read my research.
Right.
So I'm a conflicted individual when it comes.
I think no, you have both hats, right? That you almost like you have one part of yourself is in the teacher realm and one part of yourself being in the researcher realm. And that's I think it's such a a wonderful asset for a researcher is to be able to speak teacher and speak researcher, right? And so I appreciate you telling me both about that. And I'm very interested in teacher feedback and particularly teacher language. And to return back to, I think to synthesize a lot of what you're saying back to SRSD, there's an important element of teacher language in think alouds and making sure that you're clear in how you're presenting information and modeling. There's an incredible importance for teachers to be precise and provide that really, I would say, rich and process and product feedback for writing so that it's tangible, it's understandable for the student themselves, right? I think that's so vital for a teacher to build those skills. So even beyond the lesson planning and thinking about how you're going to create a lesson that's going to have that, again, that model practice loop, right? But the fact is, how are you going to use your language as a vehicle to drive your students there? I think is incredibly important, and one that I always like to underscore because it's, I felt it was something that I worked on when I was teaching. And so whenever I have a researcher in front of me talking about that, I like to just put that in because I think that's really important.
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And one that if I were to go back and do my dissertation, maybe I would do that again. But that's just a side note for my own thinking. You did mention AI, and I think that AI and the role of technology is everywhere. I'm listening to it on different podcasts. You see it on the news, you see it on, okay, what's going to be the impact of AI and technology on student learning and on education? And so in the final moments we have together, I want to ask about your thoughts about the emergence of technology. First, I think I'll start with I'm joking around. They're not low tech, but compared to AI, we're going to call them low tech, is the use of digital tools to support writing, particularly for students with learning disabilities. So what are your thoughts on these digital tools, like from keyboarding to iPads on writing?
Yeah, so in 2012, we did a meta-analysis taking a look for kids who find writing challenging, what the effects of word processing and what I'd call word processing plus programs. So the word processing plus programs had extra things like, a planning program, a graphic organizer to help you plan, or other kinds of things like to help you get vocabulary, etc.
Mm-hmm.
What we found was that word processing had a positive effect on students who find writing challenging if they were applied over time. We didn't look at something like a one-day comparison. They had to be applied over time, and that the effects of word processing plus programs were much higher. Now, we just finished a very large meta-analysis that was published in 2023 with grades 6 to 12 students, 357 studies, maybe around 600 comparisons. And it was interesting. The effects of word processing has dropped considerably. And word processing plus programs were still better than word processing. They were about double the effect sizes. But in the previous secondary meta-analysis we've done, the effects for word processing were a half a standard deviation. Now, even with those previous studies in, it's dropped to about a fifth of a standard deviation. And for the word processing plus, it was about, it was close to half a standard deviation. What I think has happened over time is that these tools now are really common. So they don't have the same motivational effects that they did, in early studies when they were tried out. You're using a computer, it's really cool. I'm learning on doing this. Now, with that said, we also looked at computer-assisted instruction this time around. It had a positive effect. And I think with the advent of new programs, we're going to see a lot more computer-assisted kind of things available. And we're going to be seeing AI used in a lot of different ways. But there's going to be a lot of challenges, I think, for teachers. I mean, there's ethical concerns, there's philosophical concerns. And just as an example, in a philosophical concern, do we want to give ground to AI doing all our writing for us?
Right.
I would argue that we don't. And here's one of the reasons why. I'm not saying I don't think we want them to help us. I think we do. But on the other hand, if AI gets all of your information, brings it to you and says, from all these sources, here's what I found. What happens is you're not engaged in that process. And so, if you read something, you have to make decisions about what's important in the text. You
Mhm.
have to personalize it when you write it out, put it in your own words, which means you handle it again.
Right.
You have to take information and organize it in particular ways. You're seeing that information more than once, so you're rehearsing it. You're
Mhm.
making elaborations as you connect information in the material you're reading with information that's already in your head. Now,
Right.
some of that would occur if you get the text, but a
Mhm.
lot of that kind of integral part that's involved in supporting learning from writing is lost. And so, I think that's going to be the challenges of where we feel that we lose something when we have a machine write the whole thing for us versus where can the machine help us? And that may be as we produce our text once we've done the research with AI's help, because it can help us locate information. We have to be very careful about whether it's accurate or not.
Mhm.
Um, but I think we're going to have to think through these things very carefully. And just like with digital citizenship, there's risk around digital tools that we use, and kids need to become familiar with what those risks are and operate in an ethical manner. That's just gotten heightened with AI. So, this digital citizenship movement that's existed is now going to become a digital and AI movement, in my opinion. So it's an interesting new path we're going down, but for better or worse, the train's out of the station, as they say, and this isn't going to get put back in the box. So we need to be smart about how we use things.
Yeah. I like how you made that you showed that example of the just the writing process, right? That humans still need to be and students still need to be the driver of the writing process, right? And of course, there are tools that can certainly enhance the way, like you said, perhaps giving feedback, right? Maybe I actually was listening to a Brene Brown podcast, and she was saying that a professor at UT had asked their students to put a prompt in write an essay using AI, but then that they were going to share their essay with the partner, and the partner was actually going to fact check that essay, right? And so using that as a tool, I think, to enhance the maybe the research process or maybe even just evaluating sources, great way. But to actually put it, uses as a tool for the full writing process, I think you're right, that gets lost in some of those pieces. And I appreciate you citing that. Where do you think AI could enhance writing other than feedback and other parts of the
Well, so we've been thinking about that.
yeah.
We just got started on a survey that we're doing in Norway with
Hmm.
teachers and middle schools, and we're asking them what they're doing. Norway has been a country that is encouraging AI use, and so some of the things that we're asking teachers about, other than their opinions, in terms of their use, is um, how they're using AI in terms of their own writing lessons as they design
Hmm.
them.
Hmm.
Because it's not just about students, it's also about how AI will impact writing instruction in terms of teachers. And I mean, you can give a lesson to AI and it can suggest, if you do the prompts well, enhancements to that lesson or other things that you could do.
Hmm.
So that's one aspect that we're looking at, but we're also asking teachers about other aspects. And so, for example, take something like, just simple as sentences. I may write a sentence and ask AI for a different way of rewording that sentence. Or I might write a text and ask AI, if it's a story, to put it in, if it was in third person, now to put it in first person. So I can experiment, I can use it as a tool for experimenting, kind of the form that my ideas take.
Hmm.
I can use AI to help me look for stuff. And I've been thinking about this in terms of meta-analysis. The thing I hate most about meta-analysis is often we'll be looking through 20 to 30,000 abstracts to locate studies because the search engines are not really well designed. Man, we might do that to find 600 pieces that we're going to look at in the whole, article. But, we go through 28,000 things to get to 600. AI might be able to help me do that fairly efficiently, and I can test its effectiveness in doing that. Right there, that usually takes us a year to do. We've
Wow.
all, think about the amount of time that we've saved. We
Hmm.
could probably design AI so, or prompt AI so that it becomes more efficient in terms of doing the coding on the studies that we're looking at, because that also takes a considerable amount of time. And then we can human code a part of those to see if it's accurate or if we need to recode. So you
Mhm.
can see, just if you take it from an academic point of view, you can see where it can not only help me with the writing, it can help me with my research. But in my case, I don't want it telling me what to say. I want
Right.
it to help me to get to that conclusion in an efficient way.
Hmm. Yeah. I thank you for sharing that. I, as we kind of, I want to ask you one other question. So the only thing I'll say is that I never felt more like in a paradox of how I feel in terms of the caution and the curiosity I have about AI. And reiterate what you said, I liked when you talked about this digital citizenship with AI, because, the reality is that we need to make sure that we're preparing and teaching students how to use it in a way, or interact with it, or not over rely, or just making sure that our students are aware and educated around AI. Because speaking of, you as an expert researcher in writing, you can use that to enhance your research skills. But for a kid who's a novice in both certain aspects of the writing or research process and a novice in the AI tool, right, we need to make sure that we're giving them the tools themselves to be able to proactively interact with it. So I love that ending part. Is there
Do you
anything else
mind
you
if
want?
I want to say one other thing
Yeah.
on what we were just talking about. We just are completing a survey with about 2,000 teachers and 800 teachers and 2,000 students in China, in the largest city in China. And we've finished the analysis on the student part of this.
Hmm.
And one of the things, when you take a look at digital citizenship in China, they're doing a better job than we are in the US in terms of preparing their kids, to be, to use digital tools, and at least in terms of what students say, use digital tools in a ethical and safe manner. And, that I think is an area that we have fallen behind in and should have been doing a better job of. I think we've left that to parents, and some parents are great with it. And it's like anything, some parents don't have great digital skills. And so I think this is something that's going to have to become part of our schooling effort, is to help students not only know how to handle AI in an ethical and responsible manner, because you can think about how you could use AI for bullying purposes, um, you know, quite efficiently and effectively.
Hmm.
We want to avoid situations like that. We want to have, not just in the US, but all across the world, we want to have good digital and AI citizens.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that too. Also, I love that you're citing work that you're doing internationally too. Just speaks to the impact of the questions you're asking and how it's impacting educators around the world. So speaking of that, is there anything that you'd like to share with us, that we should be focusing our attention to, or that you're really excited about in your research work?
I think I'm going to mention something where I think we need to do a better job.
Mm-hmm.
We're working on well, I thought it was going to be a meta-analysis. It may not be, because we may not find enough studies. We're finishing up about a year of looking for studies, taking a look at teaching writing to students in the US who are learning English as a second language, as a language of instruction at school. And, different terms have been used to identify these kids. Emergent bilingual is the one that we sometimes use. English language learners is the one that's probably most common to teachers and parents in the US. We located only 20 studies that involve true experiments or quasi experiments with pretest,
Mm-hmm.
and 7 single participant design studies. Out of those first 20, 12 of them were dissertations. Now, that's really shocking when you think about it. What that means is that we haven't funded this kind of work
Mm-hmm.
adequately. And so, I think what we're going to end up saying, and I think what the outcomes are going to be, is we're going to find that the interventions that we or writing instruction that we've used in terms of research with kids who fit in this bailiwick, they're going to be probably pretty low effects. We did a meta-analysis with reading, and the effect sizes were around 0.20
Wow.
across. And so that's pretty low.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is an area that we need to pay more attention to. So it's an area in which I think we don't, from a research or scientific perspective, we don't have a good handle on yet how to provide the kinds of instruction that's going to work effectively for these students. It's not that we can't figure that out. It's not that individual teachers haven't figured that out from a scientific basis. We just have not devoted enough attention, and the federal government has not devoted enough monies to doing this.
Yeah. Thank you for leaving with that. I think that just led us into another episode between you and I. But no, I really appreciate you ending with that. And just in general, this whole episode has been so enlightening. Dr. Graham, thank you for everything that you offered for this episode.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Read Podcast with Dr. Steve Graham. To learn more about this episode, including bookmarks and resources from Dr. Graham or past Read guests, you can visit readpodcast.org. If you were particularly inspired by this episode or want to learn more about writing instruction, I encourage you to check out our professional development opportunities in writing, including the WI's expository writing course, taught by the Windward School Director of Language Arts, Betsy Duffy. Offered in the summer and throughout the year, we have 2 upcoming sessions in June and August. You can learn more about this course and all of our offerings at thewindwardschool.org/WI. I invite you to stay engaged with us by connecting on social media and signing up for the Windward Institute's newsletters to learn more about all of our upcoming professional development opportunities, resources, and events. Finally, as always, if you have any ideas of topic and speakers, you can reach out to me via email at info@readpodcast.org. To end this episode, let's hear from Dr. Graham, who will give our final send-off.
Until the next time, readers.